but
Yeah, I'll mute you.
oh, I'll mute it.
Well, welcome to Global Justice Report, a new online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand. I'll be your host for today's program. And I'm not Melissa Young. How did she get there? Okay. Um, okay. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for expatriates and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Nature, Mother Earth, from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic alternatives, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and much, much more. At the end of today's program, I'll give you a heads up on some of our upcoming webinars. We've got an exciting program for over the next several months that'll take you through the election and the post-election milieus and put you ready to continue the struggle for a better world in the post-election period. If you have questions of our speaker today, there, do not use the chat box. Rather, send your questions in an email to this address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I'll be monitoring that and we'll pass your questions on to our speaker. That's global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I'll put that up again later when we get to the question Q&A session. If you have suggestions for future webinars, you can also send those suggestions to that same email address. Our topic today is U.S. foreign policy and the 2020 elections, anti-imperialist struggle in the years ahead. There's been little discussion of foreign policy in the U.S. election campaign, yet whether Trump or Biden will direct foreign relations over the next 4 years, there will be fateful consequences for all. Political scientist Harry Targ will be our speaker today, talking about the continuities in the U.S. imperial agenda and the variations in policy in the Trump years. Harry Targ is a retired Purdue University professor and lifelong political activist. He has written books and articles on U.S. foreign policy, international political economy, and issues of labor and class struggle. A recent book is titled International Relations in a World of Imperialism and Class Struggle. And that pretty much sums up a good bit of his work. He blogs at the Diary of a Heartland Radical. He's an active member and co-chair, I believe, of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. And so with that introduction, let me give you Harry Targ, and you can take it away from here, Harry.
Okay. Already I'm having trouble finding the cooking on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, he's got a PowerPoint, but here's the chance to see his face for a moment first.
Right, that was exciting, huh? Okay, let's see. Okay, thanks so much. First, a few expressions of appreciation and admissions. First, while I had been a longtime political activist, I was truly inspired and educated by the many trips that I took to Cuba, sponsored by the Center for Global Justice, Radical Philosophy Association, and organized primarily by Cliff Durand and Bob Stone and Betsy Bowman. These trips have been really impactful for my life. I also appreciate Radical Philosophy Association not paying attention to the fact that I'm not a philosopher. And also, I was inspired and educated by visits to the Center for Global Justice in San Miguel. Admissions. I might not adequately leave the impression in these remarks that I believe that President Trump must be defeated for reasons of domestic policy, maintaining our political space as radicals, and also to some less dramatic degree for foreign policy reasons as well. My remarks will emphasize continuities in US foreign policy over a long period of time rather than discontinuities. But near the end of my remarks, getting close to the discussion of the election, I hope to describe some of the discontinuities and contradictions between the Trump administration and what the Biden administration might do. And finally, near the end, I hope my remarks are relevant to peace and justice activists, irrespective of who wins the election. As many of you know, one can find and paste in to PowerPoint various images, and I Googled imperialism, and I think this image is very useful in describing the sense of American exceptionalism, the racism, the impact of the global North, and particularly the United States on people of color. So I thought this was a very useful image to begin with. In my discussion, I would like to say a few things about imperialism and dependency without getting into the intricacies and debates around these two concepts. I'd like to say a few things about the rise of the US as a global power, about the era of US hegemony from World War II through the 1960s, something about resistance to hegemony, a little bit about the contradictions of capitalism and the rise of neoliberalism, and also very briefly, a sketchy summary of key elements of foreign policy from Nixon to Trump, and end with a description of what the Democratic Party platform is offering. Again, I present that with some degree of skepticism, and end with a peace agenda. I used to teach a course on US foreign policy, a 15-week course, and I'm trying to present that course in about 40 minutes. And if we have time, there's a very inspiring 5-minute video on from the vantage point of people in the global South. A little theory, imperialism. And I say a little theory because I know there's a lot of intricacies, complexities about the theory of imperialism that has come down to us. And Lenin's essay, while profound, obviously has to be adjusted to 21st century conditions. But you remember that Lenin spoke about the concentration and centralization of production and the development of monopolies. He spoke about the integration and primacy of the emergence of financial institutions in capitalist societies. He talked about financial capitalism. He talked also about the export of capital, what David Harvey much later called financialization, being an extremely important element in the export of commodities. And the fact that at various points in time historically, international capitalist monopolies share the world among themselves. There's other traditions that relate to the theory of imperialism, and there's a whole honorable and important tradition of dependency theory that many of you are aware of. Dependency theory has its roots among Latin Americanists, Latin American scholars, African scholars, and Asian scholars. What the theorists of dependency argued was that, well, imperialism is largely correct in its reference to the dynamics of international relations. It really takes a kind of Eurocentric cast. It emphasizes the role of the South without discussing the profound the role of the North without emphasizing the profound impacts in the global South and the centrality of the global South for maintaining and enhancing the imperial system. Central to what dependency theorists have argued is the idea that class collaboration between ruling classes and countries in the global South and ruling classes in the global North are intimately related and terribly important to maintaining the structure of imperialism as a worldwide system. And dependency theory argues that while there's a commonality of interests of ruling elites in most countries of the global South and countries of the global North, there also is ultimately a commonality of interests of poor and oppressed people all across the face of the globe. One might say the 99% of the globe. And this constitutes for me a kind of rudimentary theoretical understanding of the US role in the world. And of course, that image in the first slide reflects it as well, and perhaps the overarching ideology of American exceptionalism, which provides the rationale for the system of imperialism and dependency. Among the libraries of writings on dependency, I like this quote by Theotonio dos Santos, a Brazilian dependency theorist. He wrote a long time ago. Dependence is a situation in which a certain group of countries have their economy conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which the former is subject. And so this is a centerpiece of dependency theory, that the countries of the global South, in the main, unless they break their connections, are very much shaped in their economic, political, and cultural destiny by the imperial structures in the North. If we look very briefly at this sort of international history of the United States, if you will, I identify about 4 stages: the stage of US rising power, the stage of US global hegemony, a stage of challenges to US global hegemony, a stage of rising neoliberal globalization. And these stages constitute both the continuity and different historical circumstances that characterize US foreign policy from the latter half of the 19th century until 2020. If we begin our very brief narrative, and I promise it's a brief narrative, we see the emergence of industrialization in the post-Civil War period in the United States, coupled with and followed by dramatic increases in agricultural surpluses, which necessitate, William Appleman Williams says, increasing interest in finding customers for US products at an international level. And increasingly, the United States becomes a challenger to the traditional British and Spanish empires, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. In addition, and I think I raised this for reasons of our concern about a new Cold War with China, but in addition, in 1898 and 1899, Secretary of State John Hay, Secretary of State under William McKinley, wrote two so-called open door notes to European nations. It seems that the Chinese imperial state had been in a situation of decay and decline. There was pockets of revolutionary ferment inside China itself. And European colonial powers, imperial powers, took advantage of the disintegration of China by establishing spheres of influence in various parts of China, both European nations and Japan. And in response to the perception by John Hay and William McKinley that US commercial interests might be frozen out of China, John Hay wrote these notes warning the European nations that the United States regards itself as having the right for commercial relations with China, irrespective of any spheres of influence that Europe and Japan may have established there. And in retrospect, as we think about the long history of elements that lead to the possibility of new Cold War with China, I reflected upon these open door notes as a kind of warning, if you will, and in a sense, a vision that China, in fact, was being conceived of by the emerging US imperial power as a potential sphere of influence for US operations. And it parallels in some ways the Monroe Doctrine for Asia. The Monroe Doctrine, a declaration of the US right to be the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. It's all these events also occur at the time of the Spanish-Cuban-American Wars, the United States taking Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And within a matter of a few years, President Theodore Roosevelt convincing Congress to establish a two-ocean navy and articulating the growing economic penetration of the world and the growing US military presence around the world with a kind of doctrine of white supremacy. And I had occasion, I think, in one of the Cuba trips to look at the history of prominent American politicians describing and rationalizing US empire, both in reference to Cuba and the Western Hemisphere and the world at large. And President Theodore Roosevelt declared at one point that the white race was terribly important for uplifting the civilization of the world. And you find statements over and over again of the connection between American exceptionalism, white supremacy, and rationales for US imperialism. In addition, in the first third of the 20th century, the United States sent Marines to Central American and Caribbean countries over 30 times. And of course, the US sent troops to help overthrow the Bolshevik government in Russia in 1917. And Woodrow Wilson himself, in a speech in Detroit in front of businessmen, warned of the danger of Bolshevism to American and global capitalism. If we fast forward to the 1920s and 1930s, we see, of course, the rise of fascism in Europe and Japan, and the emergence of World War II. German attacks first in Poland and then attacking the Soviet Union. And what emerges is what I've called an unnatural alliance. I think the unnatural alliance is described in vivid detail by Gabriel Coco in a book called The Politics of War. That is an alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, with for the purpose of defeating the German war machine and later the Japanese. And Coco points out that by 1943, it becomes clear that German forces will be defeated, and each of the members of the unnatural alliance begin to jockey for position in the post-war world. Now, we know that an overwhelming share of the burden of defeating the German war machine in World War II was the Soviet Union, suffering 27 million dead. But as we look at the end of World War II, we see that the United States begins to become the global hegemonic power in the world. The United States controls 2/3 of the world's production and 3/4 of the world's investment. And of course, the United States for a time has a monopoly on atomic power. And in the aftermath of the end of World War II, the US establishing its hegemony, it begins to create international economic institutions that for the next 50 or 60 years will dominate the international political economy. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, regional international organizations such as the Organization of American States, which to this day remains a prominent instrumentality of US imperialism in Western Hemisphere. And Truman declares a Cold War on the Soviet Union. We know of the Truman Doctrine, warning of this demonic world force, the Soviet Union and international communism. The Marshall Plan is a model for subsequent economic development and what in the Clinton era would be called humanitarian interventionism, and the military formation of NATO. Interestingly enough, an alliance system that was in its charter created to defend Western Europe from any Soviet attack. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, NATO was reconceptualized as an international military force. And finally, NSC 68. And when I give talks, I emphasize NSC 68. This was a document prepared inside the Truman administration that was designed to address the question of how does the United States respond to, quote, a Soviet military threat in the 1950s. And in this document, which Truman accepted as policy, military commitments become the #1 priority of every administration. NSC 68 says that before a president sits down to allocate any proposals for distribution of a federal budget, all the needs and desires of the military should be addressed. This, Andrew Bosovitz calls the permanent war economy. And I would argue that this has been a central feature of every administration, Democrat or Republican, ever since. Now, having said that, and as you know, skipping over a whole array of instances of U.S. Exercise of its hegemony, we have to understand the world in dialectical terms. The socialist bloc for a time grows economically, politically, and militarily. There's a rising of the global South. In 1945, when the United Nations opens its doors its doors. There were about 50 countries, and by 1970, there were 170 countries in the UN. Why? Because of the decolonization all across Africa and parts of Asia. There is the emergence of a non-aligned movement, and China joins forces with the non-aligned movement and declares its commitment to 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which I will refer to later on. And revolutionary ferment spreads all across the face of the globe. And I regard the Tet Offensive, remember the Tet Offensive in January 1968, when after the introduction of over 500,000 US troops in South Vietnam, enormous dropping of bombs and Agent Orange, the Vietnamese people rise up and for a time control most major cities and towns in South Vietnam, signaling that this horrific firepower used against the Vietnamese people would not crush their spirit of independence. Here's another image of resistance in the Western Hemisphere as Cuba institutionalizes its revolution. Along with rising resistance, there are increased contradictions in capitalism. And I'm beginning to think about, as an older person growing up at this point in time, that it may be that the period, the so-called golden age of capitalism from 1945 to 1968 is really an anomaly in the history of capitalism over hundreds of years. It's a period of enormous growth and development, the creation of a mass consumption economy, the development of a political culture that emphasizes individualism and also emphasizes sort of identifying oneself in terms of one's ability to consume. But by the late 60s, this golden age of capitalism begins to fray. There are competitors to the United States. The global South increasingly demands a new international economic order in the United Nations. The US begins to experience overproduction and declining demand with rising labor, the rising labor movement and demands for social welfare. There's a fiscal crisis of the state, and workers make more demands for just wages, and the rates of profit begin to fall. And it's as a result of these contradictions, coupled with the rising resistance that is occurring around the world, that we see the emergence of this next stage of capitalism that now so often is called neoliberalism. And the neoliberalism results almost directly not only from these contradictions, but because of the oil shocks, the rising price of oil, the increasing accumulation of money capital, European and US banks, and the increased immiseration of nations and people around the global South. And to facilitate the overcoming of declining rates of profit, David Harvey calls the new economic policies of the US financialization. A small number of banks and corporations, mostly US, but also European and Japanese, began to shift from encouraging manufacturing growth to financial speculation. A new debt system was encouraged, one in which oil-poor countries borrowed more and more money from bankers to pay for continued oil imports. In exchange for this emerging debt system, borrowing nations are obliged to move to cut their own government spending, privatizing public institutions, deregulating their domestic economies, shifting activities from production for domestic use to production for sale on the global market so they can earn scarce foreign exchange to pay back the bankers. And this neoliberal agenda, or we might call it austerity, spreads all across the face of the globe, so that neoliberal policies begin to dominate first in the former Soviet Union after its collapse, and in Western Europe and the United States as well. And the kind of personification of neoliberalism is an image that one could conjure up in one's head of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Ronald Reagan. So that neoliberal globalization, it becomes the new systematic source of a growing class divide. Up till about 1975, class divisions between rich and poor were narrowing, and then there's a dramatic increase in class divisions after 1975. And the data up to our own day on inequality, both within the United States and around the world, is clear. We see the emergence of the so-called precariat that is increasingly marginalized but highly credentialed workers, educated workers, young workers all across the face of the globe. We see the continuation and expansion of a so-called informal sector of workers. One estimate in a UN study was that almost 50% of the workforce in Latin America was informal workers. We see what Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession of property and land, and the transformation of urban life, what Michael Davis called rise of urban slums. And all of this in conjunction with the expansion of racism. How does this relate, or what's going on in the foreign policy field? And here's a list of sort of simplistic characterization of the foreign policies of each administration since the rise of neoliberalism. Nixon playing the China card to sort of split the former Soviet Union and China, at the same time undermining progressive regimes, massive bombing in Vietnam, efforts to continue to undermine Cuba, the overthrow of the Allende regime in Chile. We see in the Reagan period, dramatic increase in military spending, the development of a rhetoric about not only pushing back or deterring, but overthrowing international communism, and Reagan's wars on Central America. In the post-Cold War period, after the collapse of Soviet Union, the Clinton administration, while not distancing himself from this tradition, this continuity of imperialism that I'm talking about, talks about humanitarian interventions, more selective uses of military to undermine progressive regimes, and also to penetrate the globe via a trade system. And you have NAFTA as the preeminent model of the penetration of US and global capital. At the dawn of the new century, there's a return to the use of more use of military force than in the Clinton period, and I'll refer to that momentarily. And finally, a continuation of both the use of force and the humanitarian interventionism in the Obama period. Now, what I want to get to now that I think is important in reference to thinking about the election, I argue that there are two factions that have dominated American foreign policy making, at least since the end of World War II. Each of these factions still is committed to the drive for US hegemony around the world, but they disagree as to tactics, not vision, but tactics. The one group, who I originally called the globalist, I think it's more correct to call them the neoconservatives, embrace the following tactics. One, US foreign policy should be based solely upon the decisions of our decision makers without collaboration with others. Two, we should use military means as needed. After all, we're the most powerful military force in the world. Three, international organizations like the United Nations constitute an impediment to the United States' ability to recreate the world in our image. And that means, four, that we should reduce our priority to using diplomacy to achieve our goals. Militarism supersedes diplomacy in the practical, tactical considerations of the neocons. And finally, in terms of the application in George Walker Bush's years, the development of the doctrine of preemption. We reserve the right to engage in military response against any target that we perceive as potentially threatening to the United States. We see this kind of outlook developed really systematically in a group called the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. PNAC was formed in the 1990s by people like former Vice President Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, William Kristol, and a whole host of other foreign policy bureaucrats who were particularly active in George Walker Bush's administration. PNAC formed in the 90s to try and pressure the Clinton administration to engage in further military operations to take out Saddam Hussein. Okay, so this was a project from the 90s. If we go back to the 1970s, a group of like-minded foreign policy elites formed the Committee for the Present Danger. And they too argued that there was a dangerous tendency emerging in US foreign policy decision-making of working out compromises or negotiating with the former Soviet Union. And they became an advocacy group for getting the CIA to fiddle with the data and revise estimates they had made, which said the Soviets were way behind the United States in military preparedness. And if we go back even further, a group called the Committee on the Present Danger, the first one was formed in 1950 to advocate for more militarization in US foreign policy. There's another faction that I call the pragmatists. They argue that to achieve our ends, we need to work with our friends against our adversaries. Therefore, we should continue and enhance our working relationship, our being the United States, with our European allies in Japan. Secondly, the use of military techniques, at least traditional military techniques, should be muted. That diplomacy should be prioritized as a tactic over militarism. And all of this suggests that we should utilize and participate in international organizations like the United Nations. And in terms of military doctrine, the pragmatists are more likely to endorse some combination of containment or deterrence rather than preemption, okay? I'll skip this. And if we look at the Trump administration, particularly in terms of these two factions, we see at the outset that Trump talks about and begins negotiations with North Korea and dialogues with Russia. And this irritates some of the globalist class fraction as well as the pragmatist class fraction. But then Trump, it seems to me, tilts in the direction of the globalists from 2017 to today. The Trump administration withdraws from nuclear agreement with Iran, withdraws from the Paris Climate Accords, dismisses the role of international organization, regards them with disdain, like the World Health Organization. The Trump administration launched the most severe, crippling economic sanctions against Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. And over the last year and a half has initiated a trade war with Cuba. And finally, and maybe most importantly, has embraced an agenda of trying to respond to China's growing economic influence through the development of new military technologies, including a space force. How is the Democratic Party responding to this in 2020? Well, I looked at the Democratic Party platform, and I know platforms are probably not worth much more than their paper than they're printed on, but they give you some clues of some of the direction in which policy perspectives might be going. And I refer in the next slide to an article written by Lawrence Whitner, a professor of history, which deconstructs the Democratic Party platform. And there's a link to his essay on there. And if you look at these bullet points that I've laid out, some of them are very traditional. Some of them are globalist, but some of them also represent that pragmatist tradition that I talked about. For example, on the one hand, it calls for renewing American leadership. On the other hand, it calls for revitalizing American diplomacy. Diplomacy should be our tool of first resort. It calls for the United States resuming its participation in international institutions like the World Health Organization. It calls for ending wars in Afghanistan and Yemen. On the other hand, and one of the slides that I cut, but we could talk about, Council on Foreign Relations in 2019 prepared a detailed research report arguing that the US competitive edge on technology was declining. And in the end of the report, it points out that our competitive edge was declining vis-a-vis China. And so this particular bullet point indicates that indeed we must continue our military and economic dominance of the global system because China represents a severe challenge to the United States. Defense spending, we spend 13 times more in the military than we do on diplomacy. We could maintain our security for less. So you have a kind of textured mix between the Democratic Party's commitment to this so-called globalist neocon strategy and its pragmatism. Here's some more. Extend the non-proliferation treaty, extend START, return to the Iran nuclear deal, return to nuclear agreements with Iran, respect both Israelis and Palestinians. And here's reference to Lawrence Whitner. My suspicion is that this platform, it reflects the internal discussion and debate between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders' forces, and the forces of the Squad, AOC, versus the more traditional Clinton forces that sort of cross over from the pragmatist to the globalist point of view. But from my point of view, it's the contradictory character of these positions that the peace movement should be using to its advantage. Having said that, the US pursuit of empire continues, and we should be clear about this and oppose it. First, military spending, particularly in new technologies, continues unabated. We need to oppose them. Second, the U.S. continues to engage in policies that some have referred to as hybrid wars. And hybrid war strategies are sort of below the surface strategies to undermine and destabilize governments we disagree with. The most brutal, as I said, involved Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, to starve the people until they give up support of their governments. And third, much of the discourse on the US role in the world replicates the bipolar superpower narrative of the Cold War, only now the enemy is China. And to some degree, candidate Biden tries to out anti-Chinese President Trump. And this must be opposed as well. If we've already seen, on Facebook and elsewhere, any number of groups and individuals have talked about a kind of peace charters. I call it a peace charter, but I think we need to come together to develop a common set, a core set of principles to maintain the peace movement, irrespective of who wins the presidency. I like the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that the Chinese articulated first in the 50s. Basically, they involve non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. I like the commitment to economic conversion, that is, end the permanent war economy, and the idea articulated in NSC 68 that military spending should be number 1. And there are move the money campaigns already around the country, shifting money for military to civilian purposes, end hybrid wars, oppose the war on Cuba and Iran, and support international solidarity, support popular movements in the global South that are seeking to change their lives. So this constitutes, in short order, the points I want to make about the history of U.S. foreign policy and where we are today. Again, I think I emphasize properly continuity, the commitment to U.S. hegemony, the drive and commitment to U.S. hegemony. At the same time, I think it's useful to point out that there are some tactical variations that warrant consideration when we engage in political activity, including voting in November. The last part of the presentation is an interesting 5-minute video that I saw someone posted a few weeks ago on what was called Anti-Imperialism Week. And it shows clearly the voice of the global South. And we began with this image of Uncle Sam lecturing little kids from the global South. And we end with representatives of the global South speaking for themselves. So if Cliff can show that video, then that'd be great. And then we could have discussion.
Cuando los enfrentamos nosotros y nosotras, estómagos hambrientos, los imperialistas buscan sus armas. Cuando los imperialistas nos enfrentan, nosotros y nosotras, estómagos hambrientos, unimos nuestros brazos y marchamos hacia adelante.
Humanity is threatened by invisible virus that spreads rapidly, but we have long been challenged by other viruses such as unemployment, hunger, racism, patriarchy, inequality and war.
Estes vírus se manifestam de maneiras diferentes em diferentes partes do mundo e atacam profundamente a vida dos trabalhadores e das trabalhadoras, e dos camponeses e das camponesas, e de todos aqueles que sofrem os impactos da desigualdade social. Entretanto, uma minoria de pessoas lucram muito com essa devastação.
El sistema capitalista no tiene respuestas para esta crisis. Sus políticas son huecas. En lugar de buscar una manera de alimentarnos y albergarnos, Los capitalistas construyen vastas maquinarias de destrucción, fuerzas policiales y militares que sofocan la vida de la clase trabajadora en las naciones ricas y del campesinado y la clase trabajadora en las naciones más pobres.
عندما تحاول دولة فقيرة أن تقف منتصبة وتسعى إلى ممارسة سيادتها، فإنها تجد في مواجهتها ترسانة كاملة من القوة تستخدم ضدها، سواء كانت مالية أو دبلوماسية أو عسكرية. إنهم يهيمنون علينا بالسلاح وبالأفكار أيضاً، من خلال محاولة إقناعنا بأن وجهات نظرهم هي وجهات النظر الصحيحة.
Los administradores del sistema capitalista se apressaram a desfundar sus armas y apuntar a adversarios distantes, a conducir sus tanques hacia nuestras tierras y a ocupar nuestros lugares, a destrozar la naturaleza y a destruir nuestro mundo. Para ellos es más fácil provocar guerras que cenar el estómago de los seres humanos con comida.
They would rather inflame people with racism and jigonism than to manage the fact that a broken system has come to rely more and more on the unacknowledged care labor of women, more and more on the harsh working conditions imposed on miners and factory workers.
The planet is on fire. The viruses are on the march. Hunger stalks the land. And yet, even in this mess, we, the vast majority of the people on this planet, have not given up on the possibility of a future.
We hope for something better than this, a world beyond profit and privilege, a world beyond capitalism and imperialism, a world singing the song of humanity. Our hearts are bigger than their guns. Our love and our struggle will overcome their greed and indifference.
Nuestros movimientos están plantando muchas semillas. Necesitamos regarlas, cuidarlas, asegurarnos de que florezcan.
Construiremos un futuro que atesore la vida antes que las ganancias. Un futuro de hermandad entre los pueblos en lugar de guerras racistas. Un futuro en el que las jerarquías sociales sean abolidas y disfrutemos de la dignidad mutua. Solo cuando está lo suficientemente oscuro se podrán ver las estrellas. Hoy está lo suficientemente oscuro.
El imperialismo caerá.
Imperialism will fall.
El imperialismo caerá.
El imperialismo caerá.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialismo caerá.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialism will fall.
Imperialism will fall.
El imperialismo caerá.
So, comments or?
Well, there you have it. Excuse me. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Yeah, there you have it. An entire Purdue University course in a nutshell. And if you would like to have a copy of the PowerPoint that Harry used, we can email it to you. You just simply send your request to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. and I will send you the webinar. Excuse me, the PowerPoint. Well, now it's time for your questions and comments. And I ask that you send your questions or comments to this same email address. And in the subject line, put question so that I can easily identify the question distinct from other emails that might be in my inbox. So you can start those questions coming now, but as we wait for the first, let me just pose a question to Harry to start off the discussion. You were talking primarily about imperialism in terms of state action, governments using military or diplomatic or whatever means. But your opening slide, the theoretical component, spoke of economic factors, and it's the relationship between capital and state actions that I would like you to reflect on. During the era of national capitalism, states represented their capitalist class in their foreign adventures. But we're now in a globalized era where capital is no longer bound to nation states, but in the form of transnational corporations roam the globe unfettered frequently by governments and with a greater independence. And so that's led some people to speak of a new kind of imperialism, the imperialism of the transnational corporations that may, from time to time, call upon states for their assistance, but in fact don't necessarily need the state to exercise a military battering ram to knock down impediments to their investment. So would you like to share your ideas on this?
I was afraid that would come up. I know that, that's why I referred to the first slide on imperialism, a little bit of theory. I know from my point of view, not just academic, but from practical political action, that debate about the role of the state versus transnational capital and the transnational capitalist class is a terribly important one, theoretically and practically. And I've used your textbook in a graduate seminar that articulates the transnational or the globalized capitalism thesis, and people like Jerry Harris and William Robinson. I still am uncomfortable. I still think that states matter. States. Oh, that looks like David.
Yes.
I can't get this right. It's crazy.
Go on, Harry. Harry, you are muted.
Okay.
Can you unmute yourself?
I'm intrigued by a book that Alfred McCoy published a year or two ago called The Shape of America's Declining Empire. And in it, he argues that, relatively speaking, the United States political economy is declining compared with China. And in a matter of years, China will be potentially a hegemonic power. And McCoy suggests that in response to this possible decline in relative power vis-a-vis China, the United States is ramping up its military its military capabilities, and you have this whole new generation of research on cyberspace, on biometrics, the idea of a new space force. And so the US state, in response to economic threats, may be becoming even more important than it was several years ago. So I remain kind of agnostic on the question of a transnational capitalist class, and come to the view, I think, that even transnational capital is beholden to the political military power of various states as well. And I don't know how how you feel about that. A second point I would raise is I like the idea, I think years ago raised by Mike Davis, of class fractions. And what the concept suggests is that there are sectors of capital that have different material interests. Maybe we could say there are sectors of US capitalist class who have transnational interests. At the same time, sectors that have interests that are more internal economically in the United States. And I've been meaning to try and do some kind of research, or research is a dignified way of saying Googling, to look at the different kind of economic support that the Clinton wing has compared with the Trump wing. And what I hypothesize with very limited data is that the Clinton faction, most of the people who I call the pragmatists, are more transnational in their orientation to policy and more interested in promoting international financial institutions, neoliberal economic policies in the global South, and that the Trump faction represents, and I'm just guessing, real estate, investment, domestic banking, so that the question becomes class fractions, that one class fraction is more transnational in character, less beholden to state power to achieve its material aims, versus the other class fraction. And I almost get the feeling that that's part of what the foreign policy fight is about nowadays, between those who are more transnational sectors versus those who are more inward or nationalist.
Okay. Now we have a question that has come in. The first, let me just put it up here on the screen. Comes from Doug Morris, who has been coming to many of our webinars. He says that given that I could not shut down the music for a short time, it reminded Doug of Harry's interest in revolutionary music. So the question related to a peace agenda: what role might music and other cultural forms play in advancing these struggles for peace, anti-imperialism, social justice, dignity, environmental sanity, etc., etc.?
I love Doug's work, and thank you for attending and asking the question. Doug probably is aware of this Facebook format called Playing for Change. And what it is a collection of musicians from all over the world who play together technologically, and my mind's boggled by the technology of it, but they play famous songs, whether they're Beatles songs or I Like to Wait, the song that the band did. And there's a rendition on Playing for Change. And when I first saw Playing for Change, I was so inspired by the imagery of seeing a guitarist in Tokyo or in the Congo or in New Orleans playing together. And that imagery, it seems to me, is just so powerful. And as Doug knows, and I know he's a Guthrie, Seeger, Springsteen fan, I think there's power in music, and I think we should use more of it. I watched the other night the new film, fictionalized account of the Chicago 7 trial, and there's debate about accuracies, inaccuracies, but I must confess, don't tell anybody, I had great admiration for Abbie Hoffman. And what I admired about Abbie Hoffman was his sense of humor. And I think we've lost that. We've lost some of the musical sensibility and some of the sense of humor. Now, having said that, I'm 80 years old and I know I'm missing a lot. So pardon me for people who are younger and who will say to me, hey, well, we've got both the music and the ability to laugh at ourselves. But I think culture is terribly important. I'm very interested. I'm a latecomer to discovering Paul Robeson and the impact that he had on anti-colonial struggles and in political movements in the United States was really profound. And so I agree with Doug that this is really important stuff.
We have a question from Norma Harrison. If you would unmute yourself, you can put your question or comment directly to Harry.
I put it to everybody. Imperialism requires of us that we deny ourselves, our needs, our tastes, what feels good, that we should, one of them is Buddhism, for example. Deny your need for everything. It's and that's the supreme kind of a getting away from the traditional religions, the traditional Christian religions mainly. The Christian religions are created to for ministers, preachers, priests to be able to develop constituencies that will bow their heads and talk about how guilty they are and how bad they are, so the minister can have this group of people that it can take care of. If everybody just threw that out and said, no, I'm fine, I don't have sin, the minister wouldn't have anything to do. So if people, the thing is, we need to develop such unification among us that we are able to overcome the huge structure that makes us oppress ourselves, let alone be oppressed. The submission that our behavior is. We're demanding, in the first world, we're demanding education, as I described. That's a commodity owned by the owning class, not by people. We're demanding jobs, the same thing. If you have a job, you have your relation to capital. The church rules, school rules, the structures of our lives rule, and we're constantly kneeling to fit ourselves into it. I'm reading this great book with, I participate with a group called Strike Debt, DEBT. And we're reading a book called Revenge Capitalism. It says capitalism, that kind of structure has to be prepared to oppress our uprising no matter what. So they're always pushing against us. They're putting us in prison. They're putting us through the schools. They're putting us through the indoctrination methods to accept our discomfort. And I tell people, you gotta hate what's going on to you, to everybody. You can't just go along and love it and all these other ameliorative acceptances of the status in which we live. people self-oppressed. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
We have a follow-up question to the question on culture that Doug raised. This comes from Maitsu Louis. She says, to follow up, music, a change agent and tool for resistance. But imperialism also practices cultural extermination and the imposition of Western culture. Can you talk about how that is practiced? I guess this is the Disneyfication of the world question.
Right. I briefly alluded to the fact that I want to write something reflecting on my own life experience. And I remember I remember radio, and I remember when my folks got their first television set. Some of you are like this, and Marty Jeser wrote a book called The Dark Ages, which was a history of the 50s. And he describes that early television sitcoms were largely about working class people, ethnics, the Goldbergs, Life with Riley. There was a program, I remember Mama, about a Scandinavian family. And then he says that if you fast forward 4 or 5 years, you begin to see sitcoms that are centered in suburbs. And what's the famous, there's one about deferring to father and so on. So you see a shift.
Father knows best.
Father knows best, right. So you see an end to ethnicity. You see the promulgation of patriarchy. You see the encouragement of the young in these families to work hard and study hard in a certain sort of way. And so television becomes a powerful force for shaping cultural hegemony. And probably you philosophers would remember that old book by McPherson on possessive individualism, right? That possessive individualism was something that was basic to our educational and cultural experience. So to some degree, I would argue that our struggles today, if we get out of the pandemic, and if somehow we could move away from the horrific environmental devastation, that our struggles are going to be about culture and ideas and what it means to be human. It's on an economic side, there's all this talk about workers. What percentage of the working population are unable to work? Small businesses are closing. Universities are reopening to the danger of students and staff and faculty. Why? Because of economic necessity. And the president of my university, Mitch Daniels, made the statement once that the debt is the 21st century communist threat. And then I started reading some modern monetary theory. And the argument by proponents of modern monetary theory say that sovereign governments could print money, and that money could be used to sustain people during this crisis, whether it's small business, whether it's universities, whether it's workers. And but we live by this mythology that personal debt is just like national debt. So here is an economic proposition that is deeply embedded in our consciousness, and to the detriment of our ability to even talk seriously about addressing serious economic problems. So these are just some of the, and then let alone the popular culture affects our thinking about race and gender and class is virtually eliminated from most popular culture. So, yeah, I'm going on, but this is clearly, it seems to me terribly important.
The point about cultural imperialism reminded me of a cartoon I saw some time ago. It was a cartoon of an invading force coming ashore in a Caribbean island, and the force is led by Donald Duck, and he's followed by all kinds of Disney characters, all storming ashore. I wish I had saved that. Okay, in the people in the Zoom room, you can ask questions directly if you wish. David Schweikert came in a while ago. David, did you have a question or comment you wanted to share? I know David usually does have something to say.
And something good to say.
You have to unmute yourself. Meanwhile, I will be checking my email to see if there's any more that have come in there. Oh, yeah.
Cliff, I don't know.
I'm back.
Oh.
I was off Zoom for some reason and trying to figure out how to get back onto it. But here, I had a question in a way about, you won't be surprised, Harry, about the Koch network and where they stand on the China versus US side, and also the analogy with the rise of Hitler right now. I mean, my sense is for all the division in the capitalist class, and I was optimistic initially the global transnational capitalist class will prevent any kind of war or anything like that. But I remember the terror that the billionaire class seems to be feeling about the rise, about the threat to their own power, the rise of the left, the rise of socialism, you know, and I mean, I think they're really getting very nervous, and I'm thinking, are they just going to, okay, you know, we don't like Trump, we don't like fascism, authoritarianism, we'd rather, but we got to choose between that or the socialists imposing massive taxes on us or whatever. I don't know. I'm suddenly kind of really nervous about that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, before our program started, Cliff and I were talking about an announcement that just came over the internet of a 2-day symposium on imperialism at a place called the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research. And a number of sponsoring groups included DSA, Veterans for Peace, and the funding was from the Quincy Institute. Now, who is the Quincy Institute? That's an institute funded by Koch, the living Koch, and George Soros. And the director of it is Andrew Bosovich. And how do we process that? Maybe that suggests that both the sort of transnational and conservative sectors of the ruling class are threatened by the direction in which the country is going, and that they see Trump as a real threat to their own wealth and power. I don't know. But if you go online to Quincy Institute, they have a number of papers from Bosovich, and I kind of like his analyses, and others. And so what a curious combination, Koch and Soros.
But do you think that would make them more inclined to, you know, well, I don't know what you say about China. Do they need an enemy to mobilize the masses, you know, or, I mean, that was
Okay, I think it would be very interesting to look at their website and see what they say about China. It may be that they would say we have to have a modus vivendi with China.
Okay,
you know, that would be my guess.
Let's hope.
You know, that the anti-China mania is probably promoted by this so-called globalist neoconservative clique, minus the Koch brothers. That's
our owners have always been on the defensive against us for thousands of years. They've been checking in. Many of them have read Marx a whole lot more than the national populace or international population, and know how to maintain their position against whatever we try to do. It's not good for you to want water. You know, what China did was give water to all its most of its people. That's unimportant, you know, give health care to everyone. No, that's not, you know, that's socialist, you know, bad word.
The thing about China that I find interesting, though, is that, I mean, we speak of China as a potential rival competitor to the United States, but this is where the language of the nation state really falls down. Because from the capitalist point of view, they're happy to have China open to investment and to trade. That's, you know, we talk about United States having a, you know, a trade imbalance with China, but from a state-centric point of view, that may be a problem. But from the capitalist point of view, it is not.
But the investors are all about bringing down the appearance of China open to investors. China, after all, the investments have to be shared with China. The capitalist investments have to be owned by China as well. And this is driving the capitalists, the imperialists, crazy. And so they're making these inroads to try to look as though, oh yeah, China, you know, and build up the anti-China sentiment, which, as I say, it says, oh, having water, that's not important, you know. But
Harry, did you want to respond to this point about China as a you know, capitalist heaven?
I tend to agree with you. I remember Jerry Harris has some interesting data, right, on the economic networks between Chinese capitalists and European and US capitalists. And that's a strong tendency. I don't know what you feel about the argument that different class fractions may have a different view of US-Chinese relations. And then also, you know, you teach political science. I've never been much enamored of the literature, but there are sort of idiosyncratic factors. The history, the idea of having an enemy, and you know, Trump using what they call it, the China virus, and all of this, that there might be an idiosyncratic element too. That's part of our demented political process.
Here's another question, or actually pair of questions that has come in from Marty O'Malley. Marty is a retired lawyer who lives in San Miguel. His first question: with the emergence of new nations and economies such as China, with its beltway policy of economic, trade, and finance, is this just another form of neoliberal type control to extract raw materials from developing economies, not unlike the US neoliberal policies? And the second question, along with China, emerging economies in India, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere will likely create competitive models to US. What's your opinion? What, in your opinion, are the long-term consequences for the US? For example, the decline of the US dollar as the currency of trade, electronic currencies in lieu of the US dollar, systemic changes internally in the US system of governance, such as a more balanced economy based on the distribution of wealth, democratization for access to education, housing, and healthcare. Well, there's a whole lot to chew on.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah, well, I wish I would ask someone else. I would like to hear you, Cliff, and David respond to the first question. But one thing that I take away from Alfred McCoy's book, he's not a radical. And he argues that the United States and American political culture needs to adjust to a multipolar world, that empires decline and they need to learn how to adjust to such decline and develop mature policies and vis-a-vis other countries. As to China's, I think there are all sorts of competitors along with China to challenge American economic hegemony. It wasn't too long ago, right, when the pink tide was regarded as a real threat by Washington to US influence and domination in Latin America. And the decline of the pink tide is still kind of open-ended. Cliff and I were talking about the election results in Bolivia. There are still strong currents of support for the Bolivarian revolution. So there's challenges in the Western Hemisphere as well. And there's no question in my mind that the US as the hegemon is over. And it may be the case that the US hegemon was uniquely was unique to the period from 1945 to 1968. And again, I used the Tet Offensive as a metaphor, crossing the great divide between a world in which the US dominated and a world in which the US can no longer control. So, and I think that obviously it's a good thing for the world. As to the emergence of China as a new neoliberal type, I'd be interested to hear you and David talk about that. My sense is, at least superficially, that China's relations with foreign assistance, for example, with African countries and Latin American countries, is considerably different than the super exploitative character of US relations with the global South. That's about all that I know about question one, but I'd like to hear someone else answer it.
David, you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, I've got mixed feelings about China, although I think it's demonized all out of proportion. The thing that's bothering me now, though, is really China as an economic competitor. We're not really worried about economic competitors. Europe has been an economic competitor. There's no sense that, we've got to go to war with Europe or something like that, because they're technologically sophisticated too. I really worried about them needing an enemy now. And it's because what I think is so obvious now is the massive explosion of inequality in this country. I mean, how during that post-war period for 20 years or so, the increased productivity raised all the boats. We were all getting better off and so on. Harry, you remember. But since then, since 1990, I guess it was, things just flattened and virtually all of the productivity gains have gone to the upper 5%, 2%, 1.1%, and so on and so forth. And that's becoming more obvious to everyone. The rich are getting so rich and most people don't feel better off. They're more insecure than they've ever been. And so what do they do about that? It's not about trade or anything like that. It's about, you got to how do you galvanize the country? You need an enemy. Hitler figured that out. We need the Jews. Go after the Jews. Forget about all this other stuff. Well, I mean, I think go after China, and so on. Again, you got a racial component here. You're not going after the Scandinavians or the French or what. No. Those Orientals, those Chinese and so on and so forth. I mean, I really think that's feeding a lot right now. I mean, the kind of competition that would go on, I think, again, as you're saying, the capitalist class benefits from trade with China in many, many ways, That's not the issue. The need now is for an enemy to rally behind, because if you just look at the condition of your own economy, it's a mess.
Yeah. Well, and that suggests a continuity from NSC 68 that Harry referred to, that the United States needs to maintain its economic supremacy, and for that, an enemy is very useful. Another aspect of NSC 68 that has stuck in my mind is the admission that the Soviet Union was the enemy that we had to prepare to face. But there is the admission in NSC 68 that even if we didn't have the Soviet Union, we would still want to have a military focus. In other words, that it's a promise of an eternal military muscle, which, I mean, it's amazing if you think about it. Since World War II, the United States military has not won any wars, unless you count those little skirmishes like an invasion to
Grenada, we took care of
Grenada or Panama, but not really any real war. The U.S. has either lost them all or they've ended in a stalemate. And yet the military juggernaut rolls on in the U.S. economy and in U.S. politics. And in fact, Pew Center's polls about the trust that people have in various institutions, almost all of the institutions of American society show a very low level of trust from the people, except for the military. Very little trust for Congress, for the presidency, for the Supreme Court, for anything except the military. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Except that it doesn't seem to impact on anybody's lives. The military doesn't. I mean, you don't realize your tax, what percent of your taxes are going there. But you don't see them. You can be patriotic, you can, salute and so on and so forth. But, you don't see that, but you do see, how rich the rich are becoming and your own insecurity and all of that sort of thing. And a lot of jobs, of course, are tied up with the military too. It's got a big economic factor. Not people lining up to join the military. No, they don't have that. You got a very small percent now of actual military people, but you've got a mass. We need new nuclear submarines. We need new aircraft carriers. We need what?
And a space force.
And a space force now. Yeah, exactly. It's just
one of Nick Terce's books. The first 2 pages, he describes a suburban couple, and they have a child. And they get up in the morning and they brush their teeth and they make breakfast for their child. And then Terce describes the military contracts that each of these companies has. What the toothpaste, the cereal. I mean, it's mind blowing.
Oh, wow.
The connections, And I got my own axe to grind. Purdue University claims to be a preeminent STEM institution, and there's a research arm called Discovery Park, and they have close connections with DOD and are doing research on cyber security and other such things. And the former director of Discovery Park said that 1, Purdue is uniquely positioned to do this kind of research, and 2, it's important to do this kind of research because China's a threat.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So,
yep.
As an aside, let me return to this question of cultural invasion. Doug Morris has found the cartoon I was referring to.
Oh.
And here it is. Look at that.
That's wonderful.
Goofy. And
hey, Doug sent it to me.
Doug, they're all there. Yes, I will send this along with the PowerPoint to anyone who requests it. This is one that is so current that it's got to be widely shared. We have other questions that have come in. Let me
Can I throw out a silly pun before? Someone posted yesterday, what did the Secret Service man say when someone threw a rock at President Trump? Donald Duck. Sorry.
Okay. Here is a question from Bob Stone, one of the co-founders of the Center for Global Justice. He says, Mike, just a second, let me screen share it. because it's kind of long. My question is about the peculiar two-sided situation of despair and hope that we are in. On the one hand, we socialists and anti-imperialists face all of the threats and disadvantages of being sidelined. But what is odd is that objectively speaking, we also, without yet realizing them, we finally have enormous new possibilities. I'll list 4. First, in the heartland of imperialism, the US socialism is once again a living side in the debate and is broadly waking up to the great Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Second, there's not only a growing South-South solidarity, but multiple uprisings in countries like Chile, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, among other countries. Third, there have been major anti-imperialist events like the February 15, 2003 world protests against the attack on Iraq. Those can be organized again. And fourthly, recently, 2 organizations, the Progressive International and the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, have taken the lead in calling in various languages on the people of the world to get together globally to use our enormous strength in numbers. Your 5-minute film is in this vein as well. Okay, in short, we've not only the need for global action against imperialism, but some of the tools for organizing initiatives to move beyond it. Aren't these dark and hopeful sides of our situation equally part of our situation? Don't we have a major historical choice? Adelante juntos, Bob Stone concludes.
I don't know if he wants a response. I think his statement is great. You should include that in what you send out. I have a couple of caveats. I learned a concept here doing a little political work in Milwaukee, where we spent just a couple of months, the silo effect. And the person who told me about the silo effect said, well, we have a multiplicity of organizations in Milwaukee, but each one works on its own issue. And I think that's an endemic problem to the left and progressive groups in the United States. I was really excited by Moral Mondays and the New Poor People's Campaign because Reverend Barber, I thought, was trying to bring all these issues together in different groups. But that's had its problems as well. Some people say, in reference to the international issues we've been discussing, that there have been really ups and downs in peace movement activity. And we haven't been successful in linking international issues and military spending and move the money to white supremacy and racism and patriarchy and class exploitation and so on. And it ought to be a really easy thing to do. But, we have these problems to overcome. And years ago, when we had an AFT local on my campus, the president, clearly in jest, said something like, follow me, I'm prepared to lead. And I think that statement is in some degree reflective of our political organizations. I agree with Bob, but we've really got to struggle to create unity out of excessive diversity without destroying the diversity and the importance of each of the individual issues.
Here's a follow-up question to that from Liz Mestris. Another explanation about our situation is that capitalism is now in a deepening multi-dimensional crisis, economic, ecological, social, political, and the capitalists have no way out. In that scenario, the differences in the ruling factions reflect a range of strategies, ranging from a 21st century fascism to measures similar to the New Deal of the 30s, which could restore the population's ability to consume and pay taxes even if only temporarily.
Yeah. I quite agree. I don't know if I can't think of any words of wisdom. Maybe you can.
Well, we are in a time when we have seen unprecedented demonstrations and mobilizations, not only the Black Lives Matter in the United States, which has reached many other countries as well, but we've had, Bob referred to the massive global mobilization against the invasion of Iraq. In retrospect, I think most of the elites today even would admit that it was wiser than they were when they launched that invasion. But though there were millions, what was it? I forget the total, 10, 20 million people who demonstrated on a single day against that invasion, it had no impact. It had no impact on the elites. And more recently, we've seen huge global mobilizations around the climate change issue, which maybe have had some little impact, but nothing on the scale that is called for. My thought then is that sure, we can have massive mobilizations and demonstrations, but they have little effect unless the elite is prepared to move for their own reasons, not because we're in the streets, but because they're facing contradictions in the system that need to be addressed. And at most, maybe what the mobilizations do is give them the appearance of responding to a popular will, but that's not really why they move. Am I being too cynical, Harry?
No, there's that element. Maybe Bob should respond to but that's true. But maybe that makes it all important. Remember those slides, the Democratic Party platform, that we should identify those elements that we think the ruling class has an interest in supporting, and we support them for different reasons. But figure out those cases where we can have some effect, even if their reasons are different than ours.
I have a comment.
All right, go ahead, Norma.
Okay. I want to go refer back to what somebody was saying earlier when y'all were talking about what was happening and what you called developing or development stages in other places besides the European and American countries. And I object to the use of the word development, because what's happening is that places like Southeast Asia and so forth that you cited are mining and many other devices to tear up the earth to sell it to the capitalists. So it's a matter of fitting in to the structure that already exists, which I complain about a whole lot. I'm not prepared, although I think if we thought about it, we could all name activities, I have one, that would advance us without brutalizing the earth and working to build profiteering, which that is. I'd like to look at the myth of the better stage that the 50s and 60s up until the early 70s was supposed to have been. Everybody got rich. Well, you and I know that that's not what happened. I certainly didn't. I'm a white person and I'm privileged because of that. And I was always hanging on by barely getting along. And I was nothing compared to the black situation. Especially in my neighborhood, I lived in Chicago, where there was a line where the black people lived and a line where the white people lived. You know, they were still, you know, insulted to the nth degree, and materially, and the humiliation of living under the insult of racism. You talk about China without the, you know, I glorify it. You are hesitant about it. And I see that as needing to keep an enemy. I see that as a mental attitude that says we need to have an enemy. Well, China is doing its imperialistic activities altogether differently from what the Imperium is doing. That China is giving material support to Africa, a lot of places, and not expecting repayment. It's supporting and it's just to do it. And of course, it benefits that Silk Road behavior, or yeah, but it's still without it being an occupying force in any kind of way, which the U.S. is. I mean, the occupation that the U.S. has is stuff like what it's doing to Venezuela to destroy its magnificent advancement. Venezuela advanced to a point where it was able continuously to elect advanced minded people into position to support the Hugo Chavez intentions. And Hugo Chavez, of course, also expanded his work in a communist direction. So terribly dangerous. And the United States has taken that in and said, we're going to crush the motherfucker. That's just period it. Our own, what we call the economy here, and even uprising in as people become more and more impoverished, and the rich become more stupidly rich, even that they can't ever spend what they're holding on to. That keeps us in this custom of self-suppression. We're not rising away from that. Oh, the example I was thinking of is there are places that are farming sustainably, farming beautifully, farming in reclamation of land. That whole behavior of, unfortunately, you know, they're single parties practically. They're not broad, unified parties of people taking over the land. If we had the land again, if it were for our use, we could probably limit or end so many of the destructive mining kinds of things that have gone on. Plus,
Norma, I'm going to have to ask
one thing.
Ask you to cut it short.
We need to subsidize those farms. We need to subsidize that kind of behavior that is beneficial to us, regardless of whether or not it's profitable. It would be support by our taxes, which would go for all of us.
Okay.
Of course, that's the problem.
We're running over time. I did want to give Harry the opportunity for a last word, if there's anything you want to add to what has been said.
No, I just really appreciate you inviting me, and it's great to see some of my old friends here. And some of us met in Cuba, and hopefully we could do it again sometime. And hopefully the Cuban situation will improve.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, Harry, I want to thank you immensely for doing this today, and remind people that the PowerPoint is available if you put in your request. And you, I don't know, would Harry, could you maybe give people partial honorary credit for the course if they study your
Oh,
PowerPoint.
okay. If they take it pass fail, maybe.
All right.
Incidentally, I'm going to try and I've got this blog, and I'm going to try and figure out how to put the PowerPoint on the blog as well. So.
Oh, okay.
Cliff, can I say something about the way this is done? You know that the participants list, you click on participants, it gives people the opportunity to raise their hand.
Right.
And okay.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to give thanks to Harry and to all participants for an interesting program. And I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it. You should know that all of our revenue raising programs have been canceled due to the coronavirus. Nevertheless, we are continuing to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax deductible donation, please do so at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Thanks to the Global Justice team that makes these webinars possible. Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestras, Bob Stone, and myself. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible at our website. Next Monday's program will be Toward a Better Society. Toward a better, as we come down the home stretch to Election Day, thought it might be good for us to think of something positive. Once we're out of this mess, if we're out of this mess, what kind of society would we want for a better society? We have two speakers, Emily Kawano, who is head of the Solidarity Economy Institute, I think it is. They're doing a webinar tomorrow on the solidarity economy, in fact. And Aurelia Sadmi, who is an Israeli feminist. They will be our two speakers who will talk about their vision of a new society. And I call your attention to the time. We will be doing our webinar next Monday at our usual 1 o'clock time in Mexico. But by then, Mexico will have gone off daylight time. The US will still be in daylight time for another hour, or for another week, I mean. And so that will be 2 o'clock Central Daylight Time, or 3 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. By the following Monday, US and Mexico will be synchronized in their time zones again. We have, following the election, Jerry Harris and I will be doing a presentation on the crisis of liberal democracy that is reflected in this election. That on November 16th, there will be an election wrap-up, a kind of CNN type election wrap-up discussion with Jeff Foe, Leo Panich, Laura Carlson, and Francis Fox Piven. So keep your eye open for those and other upcoming webinars brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. And for now, signing off, this has been your host, Cliff Durant. I think we've ended live streaming now.
Okay, I still hear you, so.
Yeah, well, we're still in the